Welcome to the History Maps podcast.
Hello.
So, think about the ultimate gamble. You are 29 years old,
Yep.
and you've recently acquired, enormous tracts of real estate through a really strategic marriage.
Right.
And your next move is to just pawn almost all of it.
Yeah, you just risk everything.
You take all that money and you fund this rolling, walking city of over 3,000 people.
Mm.
You've got 1,000 horses, hundreds of pack mules, huge herds of livestock.
Just an enormous logistical undertaking.
And your plan is to drag this entire operation across thousands of miles of unmapped, scorching desert. And, you're not doing this for science. You're not trying to draw a map.
No, not all.
You are risking absolute financial ruin and starvation based entirely on a rumor that somewhere in the deserts of North America, there's a city made of gold.
It is, it's an operation defined by just blinding expectation. This is the Francisco Vázquez de Coronado Expedition from 1540 to 1542. And it's frequently misunderstood, I think, as just a small band of wandering adventurers in armor.
Right, like a few guys lost in the desert.
Yeah, but the reality is so much more complex and highly organized and ultimately devastating. We're looking at a cross-continental invasion force, really, that permanently altered the North American Southwest.
So our mission for this deep dive today is to trace this venture. We're going to go from its assembly point down in western Mexico all the way to the central plains of present-day Kansas.
It's an incredible distance.
It really is. And we want to look closely at the logistical mechanics of moving that many mouths to feed across such a hostile landscape.
Yeah.
We'll examine the complex, often really violent interactions with indigenous populations.
Yes.
And we're going to unpack the long-term biological and cultural repercussions of this march. And for you listening, we have a really robust stack of sources for this deep dive.
We do.
We're looking at primary investigation records from the 1540s, detailed geographical analyses that map the route, and actual archaeological evidence that physically anchors these 16th century documents to the dirt.
Which is so crucial because, well, to understand the sheer scale of this gamble, we have to look at the man who placed the bet and the environment that encouraged him to do so.
Right.
So Francisco Vázquez de Coronado was born in 1510 in Salamanca, Spain, and he was the second son of a noble family.
Which, in the 16th century, that means you inherit the nobility, but you don't get the wealth.
That is precisely it. The primary estate goes to the eldest son. So younger men like Coronado, they had to look outward to build their fortunes.
They had to go find it themselves.
Yeah. So he arrived in New Spain, which is present-day Mexico, in 1535. He was in his mid-20s, and he was traveling as part of the inner circle of the newly appointed viceroy, Antonio de Mendoza.
That's a good connection to have.
Very good. And Coronado's ascent was rapid. He secured a highly advantageous marriage to Beatriz de Estrada, and her family possessed enormous encomiendas.
Let's actually, let's clarify the encomienda system for a second for the listener, because it is the economic engine that's funding this entire era. It's not just a land grant, is it?
No, it's not. The encomienda was fundamentally a grant of human labor.
Yeah.
The Spanish crown granted a colonist the right to extract tribute and forced labor from a specific indigenous population living on a certain tract of land.
And in return?
Well, in return, the colonist was theoretically supposed to protect those people and instruct them in the Catholic faith.
Right. Theoretically.
Yeah, in practice, it was a brutal system of wealth extraction. And Beatriz de Estrada's family held some of the largest, most lucrative encomiendas in all of New Spain.
So this gives Coronado immediate, immense capital.
Exactly. I mean, by 1538, Viceroy Mendoza appointed him governor of the province of Nueva Galicia, which was essentially the northwestern frontier of the Spanish footprint at that time.
Okay, so you have this young, wealthy governor sitting on the edge of the known world. And the atmosphere in New Spain is already electric, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Hernan Cortés had toppled the Aztec Empire less than 20 years prior. Francisco Pizarro had just looted the Inca Empire down in Peru.
So every ambitious Spaniard is looking at the map, assuming there has to be a third great empire waiting to be plundered.
Just waiting out there. And then, in 1536, the spark hits the dry grass.
Yes. Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca walks out of the northern wilderness.
Just appears.
He and 3 companions were the only survivors of the doomed Panfilo de Narvaez expedition to Florida. They had spent 8 grueling years just walking from the Gulf Coast of Texas all the way across the continent to Sonora in western Mexico.
Which is a whole other deep dive on its own.
Oh, definitely.
Right.
But when they finally encountered Spanish slave catchers, they brought back these vague, tantalizing secondhand stories.
Things they had heard from indigenous groups along the way.
Yes, stories of large, settled populations and potential wealth further north.
But they didn't bring back actual gold.
Right.
Just the rumors.
Just rumors. But in an environment that is so intoxicated by the idea of undiscovered empires, a rumor is all it takes.
It's like pouring gasoline on a fire.
Right. But Viceroy Mendoza, he recognized the need for verification before he was going to commit an entire army. So in 1539, he dispatched a scouting party.
Okay, who does he send?
He sends a Franciscan friar, Marcos de Niza, and a man named Esteban.
Ah, Esteban.
Yes. Esteban was an enslaved Moor who had actually been one of those 4 survivors who walked across the continent with Cabeza de Vaca.
So he knows the terrain.
He knows the survival skills, he knows how to approach native groups, so he was sent ahead of the friar as an advanced scout.
And Esteban's journey ends at a place the Spanish called Cibola. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Which we now know is an aggregation of Zuni pueblos in modern-day New Mexico.
That's right. Esteban reached the first Zuni pueblo, which was named Hawiku. Now, the historical consensus drawn from later Spanish inquiries and Zuni oral traditions indicates that Esteban made some pretty aggressive demands.
What kind of demands?
He demanded turquoise, and crucially, he demanded women.
Oh!
Yeah. And the Zuni leadership, operating from a position of sovereign defense, they recognized a threat, and they executed him.
Okay, so the advanced scout is killed. Where is Fray Marcos during all this?
Fray Marcos de Niza was trailing several days behind, so when indigenous allies who were fleeing the scene brought her the news of Esteban's death, the friar did not proceed into the village.
I mean, naturally, he turns back.
Right.
But he doesn't just return to Mexico City and say, hey, the scout is dead, the locals are hostile, let's call it off. He delivers a report that literally changes history.
He really does. Fray Marcos claimed that before he retreated, he climbed a hill and viewed Cibola from a safe distance.
Okay.
And he reported back in Mexico City that Cibola was this magnificent city situated on a high elevation and that it appeared larger and wealthier than Mexico City itself.
Wait, why would he say that? I mean, was it a mirage in the desert heat? Was he just lying to secure his own prestige? Because if you look at a multi-story adobe pueblo from miles away at sunset, you know, the mica in the clay can shine. But it is a monumental leap to describe it as a golden metropolis.
It's a huge leap. It was likely a combination of optical illusion, intense wishful thinking, and honestly, the pressure to deliver good news to powerful patrons.
Tell them what they want to hear.
Exactly. Fray Marcos knew what Mendoza and Coronado wanted, so his report provided the final, necessary justification. The crown gave its approval, and the machinery of 16th century mobilization ground into gear. By February 1540, they assembled the expedition at Compostela in western Mexico.
Let's break down the physical reality of this assembly, because the muster roll is just staggering. You have over 230 men on horseback.
Yeah.
You have 62 foot soldiers. 4 Franciscan friars. You have an unrecorded number of enslaved people of African and indigenous descent who are acting as personal servants and laborers, a surgeon. You have 3 Spanish women listed as the wives of foot soldiers. And then you have the largest demographic by far, well over 1,000 Mexican Indian allies.
And the inclusion of the Mexican Indian allies is so critical to understanding how Spanish colonialism actually functioned on the ground. The Spanish rarely conquered or explored alone.
They needed the numbers.
Yes. Following the fall of Tenochtitlan, the Spanish formed strategic military alliances with various central Mexican groups, the Nahuas, the Tarascans, the Tlaxcalans. For this expedition, over 1,000 of these warriors and laborers either volunteered or were conscripted.
So they're doing the heavy lifting.
They served as the infantry, the porters, the herdsmen. They were the logistical backbone of the entire venture. Without them, the expedition could not have moved a single mile.
I mean, we are talking about moving a mid-sized town, but a town usually stays in one place.
Yeah.
This town has to walk across a desert. How do you feed them? How do you provide water for all of these people and animals?
The logistics dictate everything. They brought an estimated 1,000 horses. They had 600 pack mules. Beyond that, they drove vast herds of sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle.
So it's a walking food supply.
It is. But think about the caloric math. A horse working hard on the trail needs roughly 15 pounds of forage and 5 to 10 gallons of water every single day.
Wait, per horse?
Per horse. Now multiply that by 1,000 horses, then add the mules, the cattle, the pigs, and 3,000 human beings.
You would need 15,000 pounds of grass every day, just for the horses.
Right.
You're moving a localized ecological disaster. They would strip a landscape bare in hours.
And the scouting reports quickly made this terrifying reality clear. Melchior Diaz, who was an outpost commander in the north, rode out ahead to do some preliminary reconnaissance. He sent word back to Coronado that the arid terrain of Sonora simply could not support a concentrated body of this size. There just were not enough water holes, and the grazing lands were too sparse.
So the environment forces a strategic pivot before they even really get started. Coronado has to stagger the departure.
He had no choice. To allow the water sources to replenish and the grass to recover, they split the force. The journey from the staging ground at Compostela up to Culiacan, which was the northernmost Spanish outpost, took a full month of brutal hacking through rugged, forested terrain.
Just to get to the starting line, basically.
Yeah, and once at Culiacan, Coronado took an advance guard. He selected about 75 horsemen, 25 foot soldiers, and a contingent of the Mexican Indian allies, and he pushed ahead quickly.
And left the rest behind.
Yes, he left the slow-moving main army under the command of Tristan de Luna y Arellano, with orders to follow weeks later at a much slower pace.
But marching overland was only half the plan, right? Because they also organized a sea wing.
They did. Hernando de Alarcón commanded a small fleet of ships sailing up the Sea of Cortez. These ships are loaded down with the heavy artillery, the extra clothing, the bulk provisions.
So they don't have to carry it all.
Right. The strategic idea is that the land army, marching north, will eventually cut west, find the coast, and rendezvous with these supply ships to restock.
Which demonstrates a profound, almost fatal misunderstanding of the geographic scale of the North American continent.
Completely. The Spanish cartography of the era severely underestimated the width of the landmass.
It is the ultimate logistical nightmare. I mean, trying to meet a friend in a sprawling, unfamiliar city today is hard enough. But strip away your cell phone, take away your map, remove your watch, and you do not even have a compass.
Yeah.
It's pure hubris to think you can march hundreds of miles inland, guess where a river might meet an ocean, and expect boats to be waiting for you precisely when your food runs out.
It was an abysmal failure. The land army moved steadily north and inland, pulling further and further away from the coast. Coronado eventually realized the danger and ordered Melchior Diaz to take a small detachment of 25 men, cut west, and find Alarcon's ships.
So Diaz rides out.
Yes, from a base camp in the Sonora Valley. He pushed through punishing desert terrain until he finally reached the junction of the Colorado and Gila rivers.
And what does he find? I'm guessing not ships, not a supply depot.
No. He found a large tree with an inscription carved into the bark. It instructed him to dig at the base of the trunk.
Oh, no.
Yeah. There, Diaz unearthed the bottle containing a letter from Hernando de Alarcón, and the letter delivered a crushing blow. Alarcón had navigated up the river, waited as long as he could, but marine borers, shipworms, were literally eating through the wooden hulls of his vessels.
The ships are being eaten alive.
To save his fleet from sinking, he had retreated south back to New Spain.
So the lifeline is officially cut. They're on their own.
Completely on their own. Diaz named the waterway the Firebrand River, the Tizon River, because the local indigenous people survived the freezing desert nights by carrying burning logs against their bodies as they walked.
That paints quite a picture.
It does. But the tragedy compounded on the return trip. Diaz was chasing a dog that was attacking the sheep they had brought along, and he threw his lance from horseback.
Okay.
The lance stuck into the ground, Diaz's horse overran it, and the butt of the lance pierced Diaz through the groin.
Oh, my goodness.
He died in agony 20 days later.
That is awful. And meanwhile, Coronado and the starving advance guard are still pushing relentlessly north. They are completely unaware that their supply ships are gone, and the man sent to find them is dead.
Right. And the exact path they took during this leg of the journey has generated decades of intense debate among modern historians and archaeologists.
Because it's hard to track a group that's moving fast and starving.
Yes. You have scholars like Herbert Bolton in the mid-20th century arguing fiercely that Coronado utilized the San Pedro River Valley as his primary corridor because it offered a continuous, reliable water supply leading up from Sonora toward the Gila River.
Which makes sense. Water dictates the route. You follow the river valleys or you die.
Sure. But other geographers like Carl Sauer and Charles de Peso challenged Bolton. They proposed alternative, slightly parallel corridors through the Santa Cruz Valley or the San Bernardino Valley.
How do you solve a debate like that?
It's difficult. The challenge is that the archaeological footprint of a fast-moving, starving advance guard is incredibly light. Furthermore, later Spanish missionaries like Father Kino and subsequent military expeditions utilized these exact same geographic funnels.
They were walking on the same path later.
Yes, and they left behind their own 16th and 17th century artifacts, creating a superimposed archaeological record. It is exceedingly difficult to pull a rusty horseshoe nail out of the dirt in southern Arizona and definitively prove it fell off Coronado's horse in 1540 rather than a missionary's mule in 1690.
That makes sense. But regardless of the exact canyon they walk through, the physical toll is absolute. By July 1540, this exhausted, starving advance guard finally crosses into the Zuni River Valley. They're desperate, and they reach the first settlement of Cibola, the village of Hawiku.
The very place where Esteban was killed the year before.
Right, and the timing is just terrible.
The timing of their arrival was catastrophic. The Spanish stumbled upon Hawiku precisely in the middle of a sacred Zuni summer solstice pilgrimage.
Oh, man.
Yeah. The Zuni, who were well aware of the violent history of the Spanish from the Esteban encounter, were fully prepared to defend their territory. Zuni leaders drew lines of sacred white cornmeal across the dirt outside the village, a clear, definitive boundary signaling the Spanish were not to cross.
So the Zuni lay down a physical and spiritual boundary. The Spanish are starving, they're sitting on exhausted horses, staring at a stone wall. And what is Coronado's response? He pulls out a piece of paper. He has a notary step forward to read the requerimiento.
The requerimiento is a crucial document for understanding the Spanish colonial mentality. Drafted in 1513 by a royal jurist, it was the official legal justification for conquest.
What did it actually say?
It demanded that indigenous peoples acknowledge the Catholic Church as the ruler and superior of the whole world, the Pope as the high priest, and the Spanish monarchs as their lords by papal donation.
Let's just dwell on the sheer absurdity of this moment. You have a notary reading a dense theological legal document in Spanish to a group of Zuni farmers who do not speak the language while standing in a desert thousands of miles from Madrid.
It's completely surreal.
If the Zuni acknowledge the Pope, they become subjects. If they do not, the document legally authorizes the Spanish to make war, kill them, and enslave their wives and children. Did Coronado actually think the Zuni would hear this and capitulate?
No, it was bureaucratic theater. It was designed entirely to soothe the legal and moral conscience of the Spanish crown.
Checking a box.
Checking a legal box. The crown wanted to ensure that if violence occurred, it was legally justified because the native people had formally rejected the true faith and the rightful monarch. The fact that the Zuni could not possibly understand the language or the geopolitical concepts was legally irrelevant to the Spanish.
But to the Zuni, standing behind their cornmeal lines, the Spanish shouting these incomprehensible demands is deeply offensive and threatening.
Absolutely. The Zuni reaction was a highly reasoned, measured defense of their sovereign territory and their religious ceremonies. They fired arrows at the Spanish intruders.
And several arrows hit Coronado himself, knocking him down. And that is the trigger.
The Spanish unleashed a full assault. The technological asymmetry dictated the outcome. The Spanish employed early firearms arquebuses, along with crossbows and armored cavalry.
The horses alone must have been terrifying if you've never seen one.
Definitely. The Zuni defenders, realizing the destructive capability of the firearms and the cavalry, executed a tactical retreat into the surrounding hills. The Spanish forced their way into the multi-story adobe structures of Hawiku.
And they didn't take the village for treasure, did they?
No, they took it because they desperately needed the storerooms of corn, beans, and turkeys to survive. They were starving.
So they break into the food stores, they eat, their heart rates slow down, and then they look around. The psychological reality sets in.
It was a crushing revelation. Fray Marcos had promised a city wealthier than Mexico City. What they found was a well-constructed, highly functional agricultural pueblo made of stone and mud.
But no gold.
There were no golden towers, there were no silversmiths, there were no jewels.
The fury directed at Fray Marcos must have been intense. I mean, the men pawned their lives on his word.
The soldiers openly threatened his life. To prevent a mutiny and honestly to rid himself of the embarrassment, Coronado ordered Fray Marcos to return to New Spain in total disgrace.
Just send him packing.
Yep. But Coronado could not return. He had invested too much. Hawiku was a bust for gold, so he utilized the village as a forward operating base.
What's his next move?
From there, he pivoted to rapid reconnaissance. He dispatched smaller cavalry columns in all directions to find the wealth that he desperately believed had to be hidden just over the next horizon.
Because he can't accept that it's not there. So he sends a captain, Pedro de Tovar, northwest toward the Hopi Mesas, a region the Spanish recorded as Tusayan. And the Hopi, having heard what happened at Zuni, also denied the Spanish entrance.
Right.
The Spanish used force, breached the settlement, and again found absolutely no precious metals.
Right.
But they did extract a crucial piece of geographical intelligence. The Hopi spoke of a huge, uncrossable river further to the west.
And seeking to verify this, Coronado dispatched another captain, Garcia Lopez de Cardenas, with a small party to find this river. Cardenas rode west through the high desert until the ground suddenly fell away beneath his horse.
Just drops off.
He and his men became the first non-Native Americans to stand on the south rim of the Grand Canyon.
We look at the Grand Canyon today and feel profound awe. But how did Cardenas perceive it?
He perceived it as a catastrophic logistical failure. The Spanish estimated the river below was only 6 feet wide.
6 feet.
Because of the depth, their perspective was completely skewed. They spent several days trying to navigate a path down the sheer cliff faces to reach the water. They sent their most agile men down, who returned hours later saying the river was massive and the descent was impossible.
So to Cardenas, this isn't a national park to be admired. It is a death sentence for their supply line. It means there is no physical way to navigate a path to the sea. The geography itself is actively fighting them.
So they turn back to Hawiku, empty-handed. But just as the despair is really setting in, a stranger walks into the Spanish camp.
Who is it?
An indigenous leader from the large, prosperous eastern pueblo of Siquie, which is near modern-day Santa Fe. He arrived at Hawiku. The Spanish dubbed him bigotes, meaning whiskers, due to his facial hair. Bigotes had traversed over 130 miles of rugged terrain to initiate diplomatic contact. He brought gifts, painted hides, shields, and ornate headpieces, but most importantly, he brought information. He told Coronado of vast, flat plains to the east, populated by huge herds of cows.
We know are bison, but the speed of this encounter is fascinating. Bigotes walks in and already knows who the Spanish are, what they did at Hawiku, and what they are looking for. How does news travel across 130 miles of desert fast enough to mobilize a diplomatic envoy?
It really highlights the sophistication of the pre-contact native communication networks. The American Southwest and the Great Plains were not isolated bubbles. They were connected by established, heavily trafficked trade corridors.
Where were they trading?
Goods like obsidian, turquoise, macaw feathers from Mexico, and bison hides from the plains moved continuously along these routes. So when the Spanish attacked Hawiku, runners carried the news rapidly along these established trade arteries. Bigotes recognized a heavily armed, volatile foreign force had entered the regional chessboard.
You're being proactive.
Very. He proactively sought to establish trade and steer them away from aggressive actions against his own people.
So Bigotes gives them a new target. Coronado is intrigued enough to send Hernando de Alvarado eastward with Bigotes as a guide. Alvarado journeys past the fortress-like pueblo of Acoma, reaches the Rio Grande Valley, and enters the Tigix province near present-day Albuquerque.
And he sends a message back to Coronado.
Right, he says this valley has a dense population, fertile land, and enough food stores to support the entire army through the winter.
Based on that intelligence, Coronado ordered the entire force, both the advance guard and the main army that had finally caught up, to move east into the Rio Grande Valley to establish a winter camp.
And this decision set the stage for one of the darkest, most violent chapters of the entire expedition.
Yes, it did.
Because the winter of 1540 to 1541 descends, and it is exceptionally brutal. Extreme cold, heavy snows. You have a Spanish army, along with their hundreds of Mexican Indian allies and enslaved personnel, arriving in the Tigix province, freezing and desperate for shelter.
And the Spanish did not negotiate for space. They occupied several of the Tigix pueblos by force, evicting the indigenous inhabitants from their own homes into the freezing weather.
Let's be brutally honest about the economics of a pueblo village. These are agricultural societies operating on a delicate margin. They grow corn, beans, and squash during the summer, and they dry and store precisely enough to survive the winter until the next harvest.
Right.
They do not have a huge surplus waiting for thousands of unexpected guests. So when the Spanish arrive and demand food and warm clothing for their entire mobile city, it is an impossible equation.
The expedition forcefully requisitioned the food reserves. They demanded hundreds of woven cotton blankets. When the Pueblos could not produce enough, the Spanish soldiers began stripping the cloaks directly off the backs of the native men.
Just taking the clothes off their back?
Yes. This was not a negotiation. It was a systemic extortion of resources essential for winter survival.
It's a hostage situation. And we know the grim details of what happened next, not just from indigenous oral history, but from the Spanish Crown's own records, right?
Yes, the primary source for this period is the Tejada investigation. When the remnants of the expedition eventually straggled back to Mexico City years later, rumors of horrific abuses against the native populations reached King Carlos I of Spain.
And he didn't just ignore it.
No, the crown took this seriously enough to appoint a judge of the Royal Audiencia.
The Audiencia is essentially the supreme appellate court and administrative body in the colonies, right?
Yeah.
They possess immense investigative power.
Precisely. The judge, Lorenzo de Tejada, conducted a formal royal inquiry during the spring and summer of 1544. He systematically interrogated 14 separate witnesses who had served on the expedition. Tejada's mandate was to uncover the truth of the abuses.
And what did he find?
The surviving documents are a chilling catalog of coercion. The witnesses testified under oath to the forced requisitions of food without compensation. They testified to the arbitrary burning of villages. And, most critically, they testified to the widespread sexual assault of native women by Spanish men.
That's horrifying.
The demographic makeup of the expedition, which was overwhelmingly male, heavily armed, and completely unmoored from their own societal constraints, created an environment where leadership turned a blind eye to or actively participated in rampant sexual violence.
So the Tejada investigation confirms that this wasn't just a few rogue soldiers losing their minds in the desert. The violence flowed directly from the command structure.
The inquiry placed heavy blame on the field commander, Garcia Lopez de Cárdenas, for orchestrating severe punitive violence. Furthermore, the investigation revealed that this behavior was a recurring pattern.
It happened elsewhere.
Earlier in the expedition, Coronado had left a garrison behind in the Sonora Valley at a settlement called San Geronimo. The soldiers there continuously abducted Opata women. The local population finally reached a breaking point, organized a massive uprising, and completely annihilated the Spanish settlement.
They wiped it out, and the Tiguex in the Rio Grande Valley reached the exact same breaking point. They cannot survive the winter if the Spanish consume all their food, take their homes, and assault their families. So they push back.
The Pueblos quietly withdrew from the occupied villages, gathered in their most fortified strongholds, and prepared for war. They retaliated by killing the Spanish horses that were grazing near their settlements, striking directly at the expedition's military advantage.
And the Spanish response is a scorched earth campaign, the Tiguex War. The Spanish lay siege to the fortified pueblos. They cut off the water supply. When the defenders eventually try to flee in the night, the cavalry runs them down.
It was a slaughter.
The Spanish ultimately destroy most of the 12 Tiguex pueblos, killing hundreds of defenders and enslaving the survivors. They thoroughly devastate the cultural and physical landscape of the Rio Grande Valley.
It was a brutal pacification. But by the spring of 1541, with the Tiguex province in ruins and the snow finally melting, Coronado's attention shifted away from the destruction he had caused. He was captivated by a new story.
While staying near the Pecos Pueblo, the Spanish acquired an indigenous captive from the plains whom they nicknamed the Turk, or El Turco, because they thought his headdress resembled a turban.
Yes, the Turk.
And the Turk spins a masterpiece of a story. He tells Coronado about his homeland, a kingdom called Quivira, located far to the east. He describes rivers 2 leagues wide, fish the size of horses, large sailing ships with eagle figures on the prow, and rulers who drink exclusively from heavy bowls of solid gold.
It was everything Coronado was desperate to hear. The Turk provided hyper-specific details that mapped perfectly onto Spanish expectations of a wealthy empire. So in the spring of 1541, Coronado mobilized the entire army. They marched east from the Rio Grande, reaching the Pecos River.
But they can't just cross it.
No, the river was too deep to ford, so the Spanish engineers spent 4 days constructing a huge wooden bridge to cross it. It was a significant logistical achievement.
So they cross the bridge, leave the mountains behind, and step out onto the Great Plains, the Llano Estacado. It is difficult to overstate how alien this environment was to a 16th century European. Navigating the Llano Estacado was like being dropped into a sensory deprivation tank.
The Spanish chroniclers really struggled to describe it. They noted that the land was so intensely flat and the horizon so utterly featureless that if a man wandered half a mile from the camp to hunt, he would instantly become lost.
No landmarks at all.
There were no trees, no hills, no landmarks of any kind.
They literally had to use a sea compass to keep their bearings on dry land. The accounts say they marched north by the needle. They would have soldiers shoot arrows straight ahead, walk to the arrow, and shoot another one just to maintain a straight line.
That's how disorienting it was. And as they moved deeper into the Texas Panhandle, they encountered the vast bison herds. They described the plains as being covered with cows as far as the eye could see, in numbers too vast to comprehend.
And they meet people there too?
Yes, they encountered the nomadic indigenous peoples of the plains, whom they categorized as the Corechos and the Tayas.
These are highly mobile, bison hunting cultures, living in tents made of tanned hides. And it is fascinating to see the mechanics of how these plains cultures handled a heavily armed Spanish column lumbering through their territory.
The Plains Indians employed highly effective avoidance strategies.
What did they do?
While the Corechos, upon spotting the Spanish vanguard, did not engage in diplomacy or warfare. They simply struck their tents, packed their possessions onto dog travois, and vanished into the vastness of the plains, completely avoiding conflict.
Just melted away.
Exactly. The Tayas adopted a slightly different tactic. They interacted with the Spanish just enough to offer themselves as guides, deliberately leading the expedition toward hunting grounds that would take the Spanish safely out of Taya territory.
They act as ushers, politely escorting the heavily armed problem to the exit.
Right.
And as they wander these plains, the environment itself turns violent. The Spanish documents a severe hailstorm in the canyon country, likely the Palo Duro or Tule canyons.
The accounts of the hailstorm describe an afternoon where the sky turned black. Hailstones the size of oranges battered the camp. The ice shredded their canvas tents, dented their steel helmets, panicked the horses, and completely shattered the expedition's fragile pottery.
Think about the worst camping trip you have ever experienced. Now imagine a storm that destroys every bowl and cup you own, injures your transport, and you are stuck in the middle of a featureless void with no prospect of going home for a year.
And we actually possess physical evidence that anchors the Spanish presence to this exact geography.
Oh, really?
Yes. In 1993, an amateur historian named Jimmy Owens was using a metal detector in Blanco Canyon, located in Crosby County, Texas. He unearthed distinctively shaped metal points. Professional archaeologists from Southern Methodist University followed up and confirmed the site.
What did they find?
They found dozens of crossbow points, 16th century horseshoe nails of Spanish manufacture, shards of colonial pottery, and a Mexican-style obsidian blade. It is a tangible, undeniable footprint of Coronado's army resting in the Texas dirt.
That is wild to think about. As they push through these canyons, the food supply becomes critical. They are surviving almost entirely on bison meat, and a deep suspicion begins to take root regarding their guide, the Turk.
Another indigenous guide they had brought along, a man named Yosapate, who was actually from the Quivira region, continuously warned Coronado that the Turk was lying. Yosapate insisted that the Turk was intentionally leading them in circles, guiding them east and south, when Quivira actually lay far to the north.
This brings up the most fascinating strategic question of the Plains journey. What was the Turk actually doing? Was he a lone grifter, or was this a coordinated military defense?
Historians strongly suspect the latter. The most plausible interpretation is that the leadership of the Pecos Pueblo, having witnessed the absolute devastation the Spanish inflicted on the Tigex during the winter, realized they could not defeat the Spanish in a siege.
Right, they couldn't win a direct fight.
So instead, they instructed the Turk to invent an irresistible story of gold, lure the entire Spanish army out into the trackless void of the Llano Estacado, exhaust their supplies, and let the plains starve them to death.
It is a brilliant, calculated defense strategy. Use the enemy's own greed to walk them off a cliff.
And it almost worked.
Coronado, realizing his supplies are critically low and the horses are failing, makes a drastic decision while encamped in the Texas Barrancas.
He recognized he could not sustain the entire army on a northward push. So Coronado ordered the vast majority of the force, the main army, the Mexican Indian allies, the remaining livestock, to turn around and march all the way back to the Rio Grande Valley.
That splits the force again.
Yes. Coronado selected only 30 of his strongest, best-equipped horsemen, a handful of foot soldiers, and the guides, and he pushed north with Yusupiti leading the way.
A desperate final sprint. They ride north for over 30 days. They cross the Arkansas River near present-day Ford or Dodge City, Kansas. They follow the river northeast, and finally, in July 1541, they reach Quivira.
And Quivira was not a mythical city. It was a cluster of thriving, prosperous settlements situated along the fertile river bottoms near modern-day Lyons and Lindsborg, Kansas. It was inhabited by the ancestors of the Wichita people.
And the reality check hits Coronado like a physical blow.
The contrast between the Turks' promises and the reality of Quivira was absolute. Instead of golden bowls and kings and sailing ships, Coronado found large, physically impressive people living in substantial, round, grass-thatched houses. They were highly successful sedentary agriculturalists. They cultivated large fields of corn, beans, and squash.
But no gold.
The only piece of metal the Spanish uncovered in the entire region was a single, small copper pendant hanging from the neck of a local leader.
Let's pause and put ourselves in Coronado's boots. You are standing in the middle of central Kansas. You have marched over 2,000 miles from Mexico. You pawned your family's real estate. You fought bloody battles. You survived starvation, freezing winters, and hailstorms. You risked the lives of thousands of people, and you were staring at a grass hut and a single piece of copper.
It's devastating.
The realization that the mission was an absolute, unmitigated financial failure must have induced a sickening panic.
Coronado spent 25 days in Quivira. He explored the surrounding settlements, interrogated the local leaders, and desperately demanded information about wealthier kingdoms further beyond.
Still holding out hope.
But he found nothing but more agricultural villages. So before departing, he confronted the Turk. The Turk reportedly confessed that he had deliberately misled them. Coronado ordered his immediate execution.
How was he executed?
The Turk was executed by garrote.
The garrote being an iron collar tightened around the neck with a screw. A brutal execution in the middle of the plains.
Yet, despite the financial catastrophe, Coronado's official letter to the King of Spain regarding Quivira contains a striking admission. He described the landscape with profound agricultural appreciation.
What did he write?
He wrote that the soil itself was the best I have ever seen for producing all the products of Spain. He noted the well-watered plains, the sweet wild grapes, the mulberries, and the plums. He recognized the immense natural fertility of the land.
But that wasn't what he was sent for.
Right. Because his specific royal mandate and his crushing personal debt required precious metals, he failed to view this agricultural abundance as actual wealth.
With the plains' winter approaching rapidly and his hopes completely shattered, Coronado turns his small detachment around. They face the grueling journey back to New Mexico to reunite with the main army.
They returned to the Teaguex province for a second winter, and the expedition was thoroughly demoralized. The discipline was fraying.
Understandably.
Then, in March 1542, Coronado suffered a severe physical trauma. While racing his horse against one of his captains in the camp, his saddle girth snapped. He fell beneath the hooves of his companion's horse and suffered a severe head injury.
He's bedridden, hovering near death for days. He eventually recovers his motor functions, but the mental momentum of the expedition is broken. In April 1542, Coronado gives the order. They abandon the ruins of New Mexico and begin the long, defeated retreat south to New Spain.
Coronado returned to Mexico City bankrupt and publicly discredited. The 1544 Tejada investigation inevitably led to formal legal charges.
Was he convicted?
Coronado was tried by his peers on the local audiencia and was largely cleared of major offenses, which really reflects the protective nature of the local colonial elite. However, the Council of the Indies in Spain, the supreme legislative and judicial body for the colonies, took a harsher stance.
Towards his subordinates?
Yes. In 1546, they convicted his field master, Garcia López de Cárdenas. Cárdenas was heavily fined, sentenced to military service in Europe, and permanently banished from the Indies for his role in the war crimes committed during the Teaguex War.
And what happened to Coronado?
He managed to retain his position as governor of Nueva Galicia until 1544, but his reputation was permanently stained. He died in Mexico City in 1554 at the relatively young age of 44.
If we look at the balance sheet, Coronado viewed his expedition as a catastrophic failure. He found no gold, he lost his fortune, and he died in obscurity. But if we pull back the lens, this single failed venture triggered a fundamental restructuring of the North American continent.
The historical significance is monumental. The expedition effectively ended the prehistoric era in the American Southwest by generating the first extensive written geographic, ethnographic, and biological descriptions of the interior.
They mapped an enormous amount of land.
They mapped an estimated 3,000 miles of previously undocumented territory. The routes they traced, the water holes they recorded, and the native populations they identified provided the exact blueprint for subsequent Spanish colonization efforts.
The trail they blazed eventually hardened into the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro, right?
Yeah.
The Royal Road of the Interior, which became the primary artery connecting Mexico City to Santa Fe for centuries.
Yes.
But the true legacy isn't just cartography, it is biological terraforming. This expedition dragged a rolling ecosystem into a new environment.
That is spot on. They introduced livestock, horses, cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs into regions where these animals had been entirely absent since the Pleistocene epoch.
And when the Spanish retreated, they left strays behind.
They did, and these animals multiplied. Within a few generations, the introduction of the horse completely revolutionized the hunting practices, the warfare dynamics, and the territorial range of the plains' native cultures.
It changed everything.
The sheep and cattle permanently altered the grazing patterns and the soil ecology of the Southwest. Furthermore, the expedition's practice of exploiting existing regional rivalries caused significant population shifts and permanently altered the balance of power among the Pueblo groups.
It is a collision of worlds that rewrote the planetary ecosystem and human geography in a matter of 2 years. Which brings us to one final, fascinating detail buried in the sources.
When Coronado gave the order to abandon New Mexico in 1542, not everyone obeyed. Several of the Franciscan friars chose to remain behind, hoping to continue their missionary work. They eventually faced martyrdom.
But there's another group that stayed.
Yes, vastly more significant is the demographic shift among the Mexican Indian allies. A substantial number of the Nahuas, Tarastans, and other indigenous allies who had marched thousands of miles from central Mexico chose not to return south.
They stayed behind at the Zuni Pueblos and other communities along the Rio Grande.
They just laid down their burdens and integrated into the local populations. They intermarried.
How do we know that?
We know this because when the next wave of Spanish explorers, like the Antonio de Espejo expedition, arrived in the Zuni region 40 years later in the 1580s, they were shocked to find descendants of these Mexican Indians still living among the Pueblos. Some elderly individuals even remembered the Coronado Expedition.
That is the ultimate twist. You look closely at this story, searching for the clean narrative of a Spanish conquistador looking for a golden city. Instead, you find a messy reality of logistical collapse, bureaucratic warfare, vast biological exchange, and thousands of indigenous people from central Mexico quietly remaining behind to permanently reshape the genetic and cultural map of the American Southwest.
The historical reality is always infinitely more complex than the myth.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.